So good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa, and I'm one of the recent additions to the TALOS project. I'll be presenting on my research proposal that fulfills the second research topic, classifying and naming objects, where I'll be constructing an ontology of female representations in archaeology, particularly of the Bronze Age Aegean. So I'm only just beginning this project, so I'm very much in the preliminary stages of my research. So please understand that what I present is by no means close to what the final product will be. Also, don't hesitate to give me any advice, suggestions, critiques, or other feedback on my project, particularly on the ontological aspects, as I'm less familiar on it than I am on other more traditional information management practices, and therefore might have more ambitious ideas than are actually feasible. Okay. So before getting into my specific research, I wanted to briefly summarize what TALOS's research topic 2, classifying and naming objects, is intended to achieve. So as explained on the TALOS website, this particular research topic aims at describing and classifying archaeological materials in order to standardize metadata and therefore allow shareable and searchable linked open data. This really resonates with me because I do believe that archaeological information should be more quickly accessible to and usable by researchers, if not the wider general public. However, this is not currently the case within the field of archaeology. Most excavation and artifactual data takes years to be published, and that's if they get published at all. And in the cases when this data is made available, it's not standardized, meaning similar objects found at different sites are not necessarily described or cataloged in a similar manner, making comparisons or even findability difficult. Moreover, they aren't usually published in a singular hub to be accessed all at once across sites. This goal of standardization actually ties in with my previous academic and professional background, which I'll discuss briefly. So just to start, my academic background has been in archaeology, classics, and library and information science. While spread across 3 different degrees and therefore having been quite separate, I've tried to incorporate all 3 interests whenever and wherever possible. This has usually been through multitasking professional positions and further academic enrichment opportunities, or by tailoring my coursework to these interests. But recently, I've been closer and closer to combining them in fewer experiences. For example, this past year, I was interning at the British School at Athens, where I performed librarian and archival tasks on archaeological bibliographic material, while also participating part-time at the Athenian Agora through the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. I've also been able to merge these fields to an extent during my enrollment at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, where I initially applied for my master's in order to focus on my interests in classical Attic pottery. However, during the course of the year, this focus expanded. In terms of pottery, I developed knowledge on Minoan and non-Attic figured pottery, though Attic red figure pottery remained my primary fascination. Then added to this topic, I found myself gravitating towards the depiction of women, as well as creating Excel databases for collating information to be used for statistical analyses. In fact, these 3 aspects, Attic red figure pottery, depictions of female figures, and statistical analysis form the basis of my final dissertation. For this dissertation, I was lucky enough to physically study 11 vases depicting female figures held by the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens Museum of Archaeology and History of Art. My main aim was to analyze the iconography in depth and contextualize the scene types among vases held within the Beasley Archive Pottery database in order to get a better understanding of the lives of ancient women. So this project allowed me to understand the importance of every minute detail within the iconography and the inclusion of all information without any bias. Also, I was able to attribute a handful of these paintings to already named painters based on figure appearance, scene formulas, and outright repetition of iconography. And finally, I was able to determine the frequency of female scene types through a rough statistical analysis using the BAPD. More recently, I've been working on one specific vase held by the NKUA's museum that depicts a female figure reading. Because this seemed like such a surprising and rare depiction, I decided to research the topic further and found it to be very interesting with actually a lot of usable and underpublished data. Then, because I was able to collect so much on female literacy iconography, I've been working on writing 2 articles. The first is a more basic iconographical survey on female figures depicted with scrolls, of which I was able to find a total of 21 vases. And the other is an article concerned with performing a statistical analysis that not only looks at the depiction of female figures with scrolls, but more widely on figured vase depictions of all identity types, such as female, male, and mythical, with any literacy items such as scrolls or writing tablets, in order to contextualize the phenomenon of women reading. And this research has required me to work closely with the Beasley Archive Pottery database, which has made me aware of some issues that it has in terms of its information management. For example, there is a lack of consistency in the application of term words, as well as in the levels of description and inclusion of images. Consequently, it's the attempt to fix this issue of standardizing archaeological metadata that interested me in the TALOS project's research topic too. And so the specific project I'm proposing not only deals with information management, but also combines my backgrounds in the study of ancient women and their iconographical depictions. However, each area will be approached in a slightly new manner within this project. Instead of classical female depictions, I'll be looking at female representations from the Bronze Age. Instead of looking solely at pottery, I'll have examples from multiple artifact types. And instead of using a relational database created using a spreadsheet, I'll be implementing AI technologies such as ontologies through TEDI. So beginning with the first aspect of my project, I'll be analyzing the depiction of female figures, and because of this, I'll be interacting with and applying feminist archaeological methodologies. Within archaeology, there have been 3 waves of feminist approaches. The first was identifying ancient women as existing in the past, as well as recognizing contemporary women who were performing archaeological research. The second was then to center women rather than men in archaeological interpretations. And finally, the third was to highlight differences between gender through the archaeological record. Personally, I believe that feminist archaeologies have prematurely moved to interpretation-related approaches like the second and third waves, and have not adequately analyzed ancient women, particularly in iconographical studies. This is what I hope to rectify within this project. It's also worth mentioning that there is another methodology similar yet distinct from feminist archaeology, and that is the broader archaeology of gender. Inherently, I do hope to prevent modern stereotypes on gender from biasing my research, especially because gender throughout time has not been binary. However, I don't think I'll have the time to include representations of non-female figures now. A true archaeology of gender approach will not be possible. So moving on to my specific scope, I mentioned this will be different from my previous work, as I'll now be focusing on prehistoric, namely Bronze Age female representations. So my scope then will center around 3200 to 1050 BCE and include the geographical regions of Crete, the Cyclades, and mainland Greece. With these limitations, there are 5 main categories of artifacts on which female figures are represented. There are figurines, wall paintings, glyptics, linear B, and miscellaneous artifacts. I'm not sure at this moment if I'll be able to include all of these categories, and I'm not yet sure if it's better to have a sampling of objects from each to create a more complete ontological foundation, or if I should specialize only on 1 or 2 categories. Personally, I prefer doing the former so that way it'll be easier for others to follow an already created framework. So of these 5 artifact categories, figurines and wall paintings are the most notable types of material culture in which Bronze Age depictions of female figures survive. In fact, figurines are also the most numerous, both in just the sheer volume of artifacts that survive and in the variety of their stylistic and materialistic attributes. I've listed some of the main artistic types on the slide so you easily see the variety. Meanwhile, wall paintings are less varied in terms of style, as most follow the Minoan tradition, but they're found in multiple sites within the Bronze Age Aegean, each of which has their own preferences in terms of scene. So I think if it is decided that I should focus primarily on one artifact type, this would be the one I would choose because there's a more limited data set to be accessed while also being interesting enough for creating an iconological ontology. Less popular artifact types that nonetheless are associated with ancient women in the representations are glyptics and information provided by linear D tablets. Glyptics, which include stone and ring seals, as well as the clay sealings they leave behind, were used as a sort of trademark during the Bronze Age. Similarly, linear B inscriptions were used for administrative purposes, but instead of depicting female figures like the glyptics, they represented real-life women in their role within prehistoric society. These women can be identified in one or a combination of 4 ways, all of which are labeled on the slide. This evidence type has been minimally studied and would add a realistic view to the potentially idealized lives portrayed within iconography. Finally, the last category includes a variety of other artifact types in which female figures are represented less frequently, if not singly. This rareness might be due to the survival of the material itself or in the artistic trends of the time. While I would again like to include at least one example from each of these artifact types listed on the slide, that might not be practical. Ideally, then, I would like to at least include the larnaces and vases because of my research background surrounding pottery, but only time will tell if that's actually possible. Examples of all or a selection of these artifact types will then be used to collect information on the representation of female figures. The goal for this data, therefore, will to create an ontological framework. To do this, I'll be using TEDI, where I, as of right now, plan on having 3 main fields or concepts that will be recorded. The first 2, creation and provenance, are more straightforward as they're often collected by museums and other archaeological institutions already. It's the final concept concerning iconography where I'll create a more innovative framework. I do have some ideas on how to proceed. For example, I think the important data to record concern the gestures and appearance of the represented female figures, as well as the objects they interact with and the setting and scene types they can be found in. I'm not yet sure how I can practically implement these ideas within TEDI, so I'll probably ask for feedback once I test this out. As a start for creating the iconographical ontology, however, I do plan on using the methodology put forth by Servinu Inwood in her 1991 publication. I've used this method consistently throughout my previous work concerning iconographical analysis, and it makes sense to continue using it here. Basically, Servinu Inwood states that iconographical descriptions need to be exhaustively in depth to the point of being excessive, meaning that every detail, no matter how large or small, should be recorded. This should lead to an unbiased and therefore feminist interpretation of the iconography. As I mentioned, I think I will need to create this ontology myself, but I'm hoping I can use aspects of CDOC-CRM and the Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus as models. Or if you know of any similar controlled vocabularies or schema, I'd like if you'd let me know. With that being said, I'll give a very surface level example of how I plan on executing this ontology. So here's one of the wall paintings that I'll use with this project, commonly known as the Saffron Gatherers. On this slide is all of the creation and provenance metadata for it, though I must admit the research I did to gather this data was very brief, so the information itself might not be as specific or accurate as the final product will be. So instead of going over each specific field, I'll just highlight some things. First, perspective will be very important and must remain consistent. For example, I think when I look at the entire iconography of an artifact, it will be read from the point of view of the viewer, so things will be read from left to right. This would mean then that the female figure on the left would be figure 1, while the one on the right is figure 2. Next, it will be very important to define and consistently utilize names for artifact types. For example, some sources call these frescoes, some call them wall frescoes, some call them wall paintings. And so I think it's worth researching if there is a difference in the use of these terms, and if so, what they are. Terminology will be crucial in other fields as well, which is obvious for a project aiming for creating standardization. It's also worth mentioning that common name might refer to something like this, saffron gatherers, or it could refer to a museum or excavation identification number, though it does depend on the circumstance. I think though CDOC-CRM might have separate entities for this information, but I'm not sure as I'm only just reading their guide for the first time and at a very overarching level. The information on this slide will most likely be duplicated for the record of the artifact and for each individual figure. However, I think the iconographical information will be focused on each individual figure, so I'll be focusing on the figure on the right, labeled here as figure 2. Again, though, when I actually practically start working with Teddy, this duplication of a record for the entire artifact and one for the individual figure might be redundant and unnecessary. I'm going to start with probably the most excessive description, which is gestures. I really think that the posture and posturing of every body part of the figure holds crucial information, and so that must be reflected within the ontology. Again, this is a preliminary description and might differ from the end product, but basically I'll want to collect information on the figure's head, neck, right and left appendages, and body. It is noteworthy to mention that when it comes to the figures, I think that the perspective should not be in terms of the viewer and should instead be recorded from the point of view of the figure itself. For example, the viewer would see the arm highlighted by the arrow as being on the left, but actually it's the figure's right arm. And I hope that's not too confusing, but I think that's the best way to distinguish between right and left. As a note, after yesterday's workshop on Teddy, I am struggling to conceptualize how this aspect can be recorded. So if you have any ideas, please share. Appearance will also be a very detailed aspect as it'll contain information about the clothing, makeup, hairstyle, jewelry, and footwear of the figure. Additionally, other information could be contained here. For example, I'm not sure if this would be considered interpretation or if it is worth including, but some sources identify this figure as being younger. Should this kind of information be retained? This question would similarly apply to the identification of immortal figures, as there's no concrete way to determine whether a figure is meant to represent a mortal versus an immortal. A lot of the Bronze Age scholarship concerning female representation show how biased these identifications can be. Also on this slide, I'm probably not using the proper or agreed upon terminology in naming clothes or jewelry. I'll definitely have to research this topic further in order to create an accurate ontology. It's also worth mentioning that details such as color and pattern should be recorded, and again, I'll have to research whether there is an already made standard for these aspects, both in terms of scholarship and in, say, CDOC-CRM. Objects should be slightly more straightforward. However, I think it will be important to include the levels in which they're being interacted with, which might be subject to bias. This is something I've included in my research on female literacy iconography, and I'm not sure the levels exactly translate between the figures depicted in classical red figure pottery and the figures depicted in, say, Bronze Age wall paintings. This will definitely require more consideration on how to go about distinguishing the levels of interaction. Finally, our setting and scene type. These seem like they should be more straightforward, but that might not actually be the reality. Both of these aspects, and particularly scene type, might rely too much on interpretation. I think once I start collecting metadata for more examples, I'll have a better idea on how to address these issues in order to create a standard ontology. Also, things will probably differ depending on artifact type, especially with the linear B, which is less iconographical and more textual. This project will then be executed through 3 main deliverables: a PhD thesis that will be part of the University of Crete's History and Archaeology department, a publicly accessible web application, and participation in publications, conferences, and other similar events. Since I'm at such a preliminary stage, I'll briefly discuss my plans only for the first 2 deliverables. So for the PhD dissertation, this is my proposed structure, which I'll go over briefly. In my first chapter, I'll focus solely on the theory behind AI technologies and ontologies. The following chapter then will center around the archaeological aspects of this project, particularly concerning the depiction of female figures. Next, the third chapter will combine the 2 aspects and will be where I create the ontology of Bronze Age female iconography. Finally, the 4th chapter will focus on the web application created with case studies of its utilization. Also notable are the appendices, where there will be guides on the ontology and how to use databases or the database with AI capabilities, as well as a catalog of the collection and materials included within the project. In addition to the dissertation, I'll also create a website to hold not only the TEDI data set I create, but also hold other relevant information, as you can see from the mock-up I have on the screen. For example, a lot of the information collected and used in the dissertation will find a place on the website, as will information on the project itself and the collections objects used. I'd also like to record my bibliography and other resources here, and potentially also an open source copy of my dissertation, as well as any other presentations, workshops, or publications I participate in during the 3-year program. For example, I'll maybe want to post this presentation on the site. So to summarize, I hope to create the framework for an ontology of Bronze Age Aegean representations of female figures, which combines multiple disciplines that have really been quite separate up until now. This project will also hopefully allow researchers to access information about the depiction of women in an easily searchable way. For example, it could be used to more readily recognize patterns and depictions across media, space, and time. Moreover, this project is particularly exciting because it has a ton of room for expansion. Although my dataset might be limited by external factors like time restraints, I can create an ontology that can be replicable by others, hopefully in an easy, straightforward manner. This means that archaeologists can add their own data about iconography. And the project could result in not only focusing on Bronze Age Aegean female representations, but can grow to include Aegean female representations from the Archaic through to Hellenistic times, Aegean non-female representations, such as those depicting male figures or mythical ones, or it can even develop into a project that has no geographic or temporal boundary. So thank you all for bearing with me during this basic overview of my project. I'm hoping that once I formally start, I'll quickly be able to develop my project further and have a better idea of how I'll proceed. Definitely my primary challenge will be in wrapping my head around how to create the ontology itself, but I also imagine there will be obstacles in collecting the metadata for these archaeological artifacts. Because of this, my main strategy of attack is to learn more about ontologies and AI and begin researching generally on the different artifact types. In the meantime, I'll certainly focus on the background research, particularly on ancient female representations, the Bronze Age, and information management in terms of archaeology. Again, if you have any comments or critiques, please let me know. Any thoughts will be greatly appreciated. Thank you.